Alrighty. So welcome everybody. We are doing a Do UX book club. It's been a minute since we've had an event like this. It's a discussion-based event. So in the next couple of slides, we'll go through a couple of questions. So having your video on is encouraged. Feel free to speak up unless you're Jason. And then if you prefer, you can also enter stuff in the chat. I'll try to keep up with that. Maybe one of the other co-organizers can also help out. Let's see, what do we got here? So this is everything that I just said. If you've got questions, definitely add them into the comments. If things get out of hand, we can start the hand raising, but I don't even know how to hand raise in Zoom, so good luck with that. I'm Leah, one of the co-organizers for DUX. Abhishek is here as well, so is Wes, Jason, and Matt. You can find all of us on LinkedIn. DUX's mission is to create opportunities for anyone to learn and share knowledge about the field of user experience. And today we are actually going to be talking about inclusive design. And if you saw in the Meetup post, we had a link to an article called An Accessible Guide to Inclusive Design by Bruno Perez. He is going to be with us for a couple of minutes. I don't know, Bruno, do you want to do a quick intro and let us know if you want us following you anywhere in particular?
Yeah, not exactly. So first of all, thank you everyone for choosing my article to be part of your discussion. So for me, it's a pleasure to be here. It's a bit late for me because, I'm London based. So it's a bit late, like almost midnight. But I couldn't let the opportunity pass to be with you guys and at least for me to answer a few questions. And basically, this article is the second chapter of a series of 4 that I wrote last year. And basically, the reason why I joined that path of inclusive design is because I learned from my experiences that people have different needs when it comes to products and services. And, we need sometimes to create better environments to allow everyone to participate, right? So this is why I wrote this articles. I'll not give away much because I think you guys can read the other ones and know more about myself and about more details on why I joined the inclusive design crew, let's say, put in these words. But yeah, so I think this is a quick intro, and I'm currently working at BCG in the design practice in there as a strategic designer. So yeah, I don't know what else you guys want to know.
No, that's great. Thank you. That's awesome. I enjoyed the article. If you didn't get a chance to check it out, there's some really awesome illustrations in there. I think those did an amazing job as well. Your writing is great, but those really kind of put into perspective some of the things that maybe are difficult to explain in words. So speaking of difficult things to explain in words, first question for the group is, what does inclusion mean to you? And I'll let that sink in for a second. If anybody wants to chime in.
I can go first then. Dude, that I still here. I think for me, it's like I said in the beginning, inclusion for me, it's creating that environment where everyone can participate, can be part of it. And not just thinking about customers and users, but people itself. So basically, I need to have an inclusive environment at home so my family can participate in all the activities. So for the didn't read the other articles, my son is deaf, so we need to create a certain environment to allow him to participate and have a normal life, either in school or at home. And I think this is what inclusion means, understanding that different needs and nuances in case of my son, it's a particular disability, but we have different ways to understand disability as well. So it's just inclusion for me. It's allow people to participate.
I'll go ahead and mention too, before I dove into the article, when I think of inclusion, the first thing that popped into my head was sort of all of the diversity and inclusion conversations that are going on now, and have always happened, in the workplace. So even areas outside of product design. And like one example that like off the top of my head that I can think of is in the article, it mentions the like cultural diversity. And I had the opportunity to sit on a phone call with Advent Health's customer support. And my goal was to do a little bit of research on the people that were calling. And everyone that called just so happened to be speaking Spanish. So I didn't understand any of the feedback that I was getting from them. So it just really painted a really clear picture. Like there's a lot of situations where like bilingual people on your team are pretty much a requirement. I think especially here in Florida, that could apply to anywhere, the service industry, retail industry. So that's one of the things that I thought of.
I can chime in. I think it's hard for me exactly to like pin down what does inclusion mean to me, but the thing that comes to mind is intention. It's sort of around, UX design in general, like whether you mean to or not, everything's designed. Whether you mean to or not, everything has a certain level of inclusion or exclusion. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges that we have as designers, right? Is the like accidental exclusion where we design things to meet certain, what we consider norms, or whatever kind of that target market we're defining in our mindset of a product, or folks that look like us that use systems the way that we use systems, whatever it might be. So I think to me, when I think about inclusion and this conversation, I really think about like that word intentionally, purposefully bringing into our design practices that like act of considering how can we design something to be inclusive.
I'll go. So it's kind of funny, but when I think inclusion, I think of Lilo and Stitch, where like Ohana means nobody gets left behind. And I kind of think about that. But I don't know. I mean, inclusion means a lot. And I feel like it's always being redefined because it's always challenging my bias. So I always think I know what it is. And then like a week goes by or something happens. I'm like, oh, I didn't think of that. So it's always just challenging my self-bias and what I think is it's really, I don't know anything. But it's also being present and having like not avoiding people. I may not 100% agree with them, but I have to give them space to present themselves and be patient with that. And that's all.
And I'll follow up on that. I think a lot of inclusion is, and Bruno talks about this in the article, is going beyond those biases to take on that perspective and allow others to participate. Last year I had the chance to work on a project addressing how Black males are at the lowest point in the history of the United States, well, at least in the last 50 years when it comes to the inclusion of medicine. And all these systemic things from what's happening in elementary school, high school, middle school, college, that were just completely invisible to me, really factor into this and making sure that we're at least being mindful of that and inclusive of those things that are or traditionally have been some of those barriers in the past.
And then something that I found interesting in the article was one of the images, it had the alt text that basically said disability is context dependent. And I think that's super important to keep in mind when we're to be an inclusive designer as well. And it's not something that I always think about. So when I saw it, I was just like, wow, that is a great point to bring up, because, you know, there are permanent and situational differences that if we were designing to include all, then it would be helpful for all.
Cool. Thanks everyone for sharing. I'm going to go into the next slide. So we talked about what we think of with inclusion. So what is actually inclusive design? How could we define that?
Okay, can I start? I think will be my last participation before I go, but I think so by different things that I read through to put the article together, I think the most important aspect of inclusive design is that it's understand it is an extra lens. It's not a, it's quite a lens that you add on top of your design process that helps you to see beyond the basics, beyond your biases and so on. And it's extremely important to sell it properly to leadership and to CEOs and to product owners or whatever is the multidisciplinary team we work with, and elevate the discussion around inclusive design beyond accessibility, because we have a lot of discussions, I think, in our day-to-day job about say, yeah, we do accessibility afterwards, or yeah, it's just accessibility. Let's change this thing around the corner when the regulation make it required. And actually, we are missing a massive mark and a massive opportunity to create better products, because inclusive design, it's more than accessibility. It's like you mentioned earlier in terms of the contextual dependent on the disability. And it's not just about disability, it's about gender equality, it's about, people from different backgrounds, different origins, and understanding this, like the language barriers and so on. It's basically having that lens allows you to understand the world around you and creating something that allow people to participate. And if don't, you take the decision to take people out of the participation with a specific reason, but not causing harm, I think, because it can generate harm.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned too how important it is to not just understand what you're doing. The note that I have here, this was from the article, is it's the methodology that enables and draws on the full range of human diversity. Most importantly, this means including and learning from people with a wide range of perspectives. And I think thinking of it as a methodology, and then also thinking about how am I going to pitch this to the business, to the people up top, to our stakeholders, that's definitely something interesting to think about.
Yeah, like for me, and like to add to what Bruno you were saying, I think it's definitely a lot more than accessibility. I feel like accessibility is the starting point for a lot of people who never considered that there is another user apart from your ideal user who's going to use your product. And accessibility kind of helps you better understand that, well, here's all these other problems people face with the things you're building, with the things you're shipping that you don't see. And following these rules and understanding how they work, why they're important, and baking them into the product helps you make these products a little bit better for those sort of a specific category of people. However, that kind of, for me at least, that was my foot into understanding, well, even that is a limited perspective of how you're approaching it. Because one of the things I think sort of most designers tend to do intuitively is you have this in your head, you have this idea maze of a person is going to go to this page and this page and this page and this page, and that person, like, at least is the most the able person who can do that, right? And then you have to kind of reverse that thinking into thinking, well, what if a person who wants to get there is not your ideal person? What if they don't understand how products work? Or what if they are not familiar with technology? What if their only exposure to the internet was mobile? right? Like, how do you build something that is inclusive to everyone, no matter sort of how they came onto this path? And that does require a separate level of rigor outside of just building a flow that works for this cohort of users that you have. So I really like the idea of a methodology because it does impose an additional constraint, which I think is better because with the end result will actually be more usable to a broader number of people if you were to take on that additional constraint of how does this work for more people other than like the ideal users, the people who have accessibility needs and beyond.
Yeah, so when I think inclusive design, I think like we should include the people in the design process that we're designing for. So there's a lot of times where I'm tabbing through things because I'm thinking of someone that's using a screen reader, but like I never seen anyone that is like blind or hard of hearing actually use my product, and I'm assuming this is how they would use it. And I just find it so weird that we don't include the people we are designing for, and we're kind of like inputting ourselves, like our bias, and thinking this is how it's going to work. And we don't think of them as creators and like that they can solve their problem as well. For some reason, as designers, we think we know the solution because we're designers, but yet we don't think of them as like, maybe we should ask them and maybe they have a solution because they are creators. Like if you look at time, many disabled people were able to come up with solutions and create and makeshift things for themselves to make things better. So when I think of inclusive design, I just think we should include them in the design process from the very beginning and test with them and include their feedback and think they should be owners of the solution as well.
Yeah, I have to agree with Selena. I mean, I think inclusive design isn't that far from the baseline of UX design, right? Like in UX, we're successful when we include users at every step of the process. But I think inclusive design is actively and intentionally engaging with a wide range of users. So this shouldn't be a huge leap, but just another step towards, adapting and growing based on what we learn.
And yeah, kind of jumping off of adapting, just being flexible. I mean, design, we all know the process is iterative, so it's constantly changing. So I'm kind of going off of, I'm sorry, I forgot who mentioned how you shouldn't just make the assumption of one path, like one path that everybody does. Maybe that path worked for one group and it's like, yay, but when you, as Selena mentioned, when you include another user and they come up with a solution you didn't think about, now you've got to make that change. So you have to always be flexible. So I don't know if that's a definition or more so a requirement, something like that.
So I've heard a couple people talk about accessibility. So the next question here is, what are the differences between inclusive design, accessibility, and universal design?
So
Should I do the last one? And then I go. I promise. Because I was writing to Maria that I will leave, but I just to warm up this one before I go. I think the perspective I have on these three things, it's like simple, like the accessibility is like someone mentioned earlier. It's about the starting point and where most of us start to think about inclusivity, right? So it's the technical aspect of a product and a service. On the other hand, you have the universal design, which is designing something to everyone, right? A thing that is used to everyone in all the aspects, the physical aspects, more architecture, and so on. And then when we come to the inclusive design, it's basically designing something that include a specific group of users, a specific need. So it's basically we have the three rules, right? Which is understanding the exclusion, learning from that diversity, and solve for then and extend to many, which is basically the common speech I give to the stakeholders, which is basically, yes, you're creating something unique because you are solving a problem that you don't even realize you may have, and extending that solution to many others, and creating what we call the basis of innovation. So pretty much like along these lines for me. And before I hand the word to someone else, I just would like to thank you guys again. I need to go because I have a really early start tomorrow. and thank you for having me.
Thank you. Get out of here. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great day tomorrow, too.
I took a couple notes here from the article. The definition under accessibility says the qualities that make an experience open to all. It provides minimum ways to allow users to use your product or service, for example, color contrast. And then universal design was the way we design an environment to make it accessible and usable in the widest possible range of situations without the need for adaptation. So I thought those were really interesting ways of putting it. Does anyone else have any thoughts?
Yeah, I was going to chime in and say, like, I imagine for folks here who have conducted user research for kind of any extent of time, you've probably conducted research with somebody who has some kind of different situation, whether blind or, in fact, I was just on a session with somebody the other day where they said, it's a little hard for me to see things, so I usually zoom in, and I was sharing my screen, so I like zoomed in to 130%, 140%, right? But it's like, it's interesting to think about how other people are experiencing the things we design. And whenever I think about a question like this, I actually end up getting stuck on this place of not just like, as user experience designers, we're trying to create an optimum experience. We're not just trying to put text, have a button, whatever, assemble some components, but we're thinking about what does that copy say? How does the user go through this journey? And when you think about what your application is like with a screen reader, or when it's extremely zoomed in like that, it is a different experience. And I think that's something that's interesting, where I feel like that's like that highest level where you're maybe even thinking about an almost different experience of the same content, just through how can we design to make sure when somebody is using a screen reader, they actually have the right landmarks to be able to jump to a menu, jump to the content without having to go through all of the website the way that, if you, can just kind of look at it and move your mouse, you could just jump to that content, right? So there's a lot of interesting things to that I think, you're adding in design aspects that go beyond just the normal checking the box of accessibility.
Yeah, well, to add to that, I feel like when Bruno was talking about sort of the three different ways he's describing these, the image that came to my head was like there is a wide variety of people with differing needs, and sort of how broad do you want, not necessarily how broad do you want to solve the problem, but how broadly can all of them leverage the thing you're building. Right? Typically, I think the UX design of the old was like, well, let's find this cohort of people that can come and kind of put something that the cohort of people, the solution will work for them. However, we can kind of be broader in terms of, well, can we actually try to build this in a way that definitely solves it for most people that need to use it, also accounts for people that have different needs, but ultimately also accounts for people that have very specific needs, perhaps, but we are being inclusive to that population because there is something we certainly want to make sure that they're not disenfranchised by the thing we're trying to build. And I think that's one way I kind of help visualize it. And it's directly opposite to how I started off as a designer, where you're trying to be very specific about understanding a user, developing a specific persona of who this person is. And I think this goes counter to that sort of narrative of that there is like an ideal person you can imagine, and that's kind of who you build it for. But I think the differences that Bruno alluded to really clarify, for me at least, that you want to focus on these different groups to try to design and build something.
I can go next. So when I think of accessibility, I usually the picture that comes to my mind is people with like different abilities, and there are a variety of rules. There's a lot of tooling around what people can what developers or anyone who's building an accessible product can look at and figure out how to build something. But when it comes to inclusive design or universal design, I think that people have not just have different physical abilities, but they also have different cognitive abilities, depending on where they uh, depending on their experiences in life, and where they are, depending on age, depending on context of where your product is being used, right? So I think yeah, so when you're trying to do something more like inclusive design, you have to bring those perspectives into your product, things that you as an individual can never experience, right? Until you hear or see someone actually use your product in a different way. So that's what I think of.
So I want to go into the next slide. The next couple of questions touch on the principles that Bruno was talking about. The first one being to recognize exclusion. So what can we all do to better recognize exclusion? And I know there were already a couple of things said earlier that tie into this, but maybe someone's got some examples.
I guess we could think a little bit about what type of hardware people might be using. You know, flip phones, desktops, right? What kind of, are they using an older smartphone, or maybe they're using a tablet, right? How can we account for all of those, and how are they trying to access the information that we're trying to provide, or allow them to interact with our products that we're designing for them? I think that's something that we can consider.
I know a big eye-opener for me was when Advent Health had COVID vaccination events, and I actually went out to help volunteer, and getting to see just a wide variety of diverse people using our product firsthand. It was like, wow, I don't know that I would have thought of half of these scenarios while trying to build this. So thinking back on that, I'm like, man, if only there were a way for every single thing that we do to have that kind of interaction firsthand with our consumer. And I think part of recognizing exclusion is thinking about what can we do earlier on in the process.
I think just like how we have ramps to get into specific buildings, or really all buildings now, we need to ensure that if we do research, that they can access our tools, right? If they can't sign up for a specific research activity, if they can't participate in a screener, they're never going to be accessible to, we're not going to be able to access them. So just ensuring that whatever we can do to ensure that not only make them accessible to our product, but accessible to us, so that we can experience them in their environments, and being able to observe them. So I think for me, that was a real eye opener, is just ensuring that when we do research, that they can even access our tools, and vice versa.
I think also sharing the experience as best as possible. I mean, that's kind of the flaw I feel with the idea of empathy, where it's like, oh yeah, you know exactly how someone's going to feel, but especially when it comes to like actual physical disabilities, yeah, you may be able to makeshift it, but in the end, you can always walk away. But in my experience, so I'm trying to learn a new language, Spanish. So I changed my phone settings. Everything's in Spanish. So that actually helped me to actually, it wasn't even the intention of trying to see if any of my apps were accessible for people who struggle with language in any way. But as I'm going through my apps, I'm realizing, you know, it's how important it is to use icons, to use imagery, how important it is to really use plain language. And even some apps that I would assume would be inclusive really aren't. So it's an eye opener just to kind of share that experience in a very small scale.
Yeah, to piggyback off what Faith said, like I remember what Jasmine Orange said, where don't use empathy, use compassion instead. So empathy is like when you have the capacity to understand, but compassion is like you go out of your way to understand. And I think we just need to force ourselves into situations that we may not feel comfortable in, and like understand what, like just understand how we can understand it, basically. But yeah, use compassion instead of empathy. It's probably one way to go about it.
Yeah, I really love that point, because I think one of the things I keep thinking about is, well, what other field or what other sort of discipline can we actually leverage that maybe it helps us better understand how we can like be better at recognizing exclusion. And one thing I think about is like, although it does not directly correlate, like the concept of a method actor in like film. Although that's a little bit of an extreme, and I know they're doing it for a specific thing, but I have heard stories about the person who, although I should have their name, the person who invented the Palm Pilot actually had a brick the size of a Palm Pilot in their pocket, and they walked around with it all day and tried to like operate it. So all of that, I have to assume that helped them understand the constraints of building something, and like what that would feel like to have that in your pocket all day and kind of use it for better or for worse. Right. And I have heard also stories of like really amazing designers on YouTube and other places really kind of like blindfolding them, or potentially like using their entire product without keyboard and mouse to kind of simulate experiences that other people would have. And I have to assume that they were being very intentional about not trusting their own opinions of that this will work or not, and kind of really putting themselves to test the thing that they're going after. And I think that intention, kind of going back to what Matt was saying earlier, and also coming up with interesting sort of strategies to simulate experiences that other people potentially would have, I think are great ways for us to understand ways that we're probably continuously biased, where like the same sort of errors we keep making again and again. So we did an audit of our product, and something we realized was there are certain problems that are not at all like across the board we're good at it, and there are other problems where it's endemic to the product. And I think that is just like something that someone has like we've not learned as a group or something like that, and helping other people understand that, I think would also go a long way in helping us just be better at recognizing exclusion when it happens.
One thing I'd like to add to this is thinking about the medium in which we are delivering our product to users. So for example, a lot of us work or had been working in the past from offices where we had high-speed internet, and most of our products, or many of us work in internet-based products, right? And we kind of assume that people are going to be able to use it at that speed when we share it with them. But the moment when we ourselves turn on the VPN, we feel that the app is sluggish, and then we turn it off and we go back to using it without the VPN. So think about like how our users might be maybe in the subway, or they might be in a city with a lot of buildings, or they might be far away. And then at that time, are our products even usable? Are we excluding them just because maybe they don't have the finances to pay for a high-speed internet connection on their phone? So maybe they just don't want to use the product right now because it's a data hog. So there are things like that we might be excluding our users by not thinking about how they are using our product and what scenarios they're using the product.
That's a really good point, Ryan. I remember like Facebook's sort of 2G program where they basically built like 2G hubs, so designers and engineers could actually test what the product was at 2G speeds, which I thought was crazy, because like you're all here and you don't need to, but that is so intentional about something where they're trying to go after markets that don't have 4G or anything like that, which is really nice to watch. So that's a really good point.
I think I will also throw out, kind of following that thought process, Abhishek, that always kind of doing that user research with somebody who's like living with something as an experience is going to highlight things that we wouldn't otherwise be able to find. Like I've tried to use an application with JAWS and turned my monitor off, but I still think that there's something that, like, at the end of the day, I can turn my screen back on and kind of, have a mental model because I've seen a picture and things like that. So I think kind of just, reminding us all that, like, conducting that research with people who, have certain experiences that are different than ours can be really, really helpful for that as well.
So I'm going to go to the next slide. What are some examples of disabilities or mismatched human interactions? I'll start off with this note that I took, because a couple people have mentioned here about how a lot of the time it's very context dependent or scenario dependent on what the actual disability is. And the note here is, when designers recognize disability through the lens of a mismatched interaction, it helps us to recognize our responsibility more clearly. It's also necessary to understand that disability is context dependent. For example, and there was a really great illustration in the article about this, but there could be a permanent disability, like somebody who only has one arm, or a temporary disability. Someone got an arm injury and is now in a cast. Or a situational one, like there's a new parent and they're having to use their phone while holding a child. So I thought those were some interesting examples. I don't know if anyone else has some.
When I was reading,
Just a,
oh, sorry.
sorry, go ahead.
I think when I was reading this, for me, something that stood out was like people who are different heights. I think there was like a trend on the internet, like a little, like earlier last year or something, where, where shorter people basically taped their phone, where, at like a higher height or something, and then they looked at it and they're like, is this how the world sees me, and is this how I see the world? And I thought that was an interesting idea. It might not be directly related to UX or UI design, but I thought that was interesting. Also, like designing for the elderly, designing for people where it's, when you're young, you might have like, more familiarity with using technology or things like that, but keeping in mind that there are people, like, I thought having the elderly was a good example.
Yeah, I think for me, when I heard disability, or when I hear disability, this was my own personal issue, right? Like, I automatically thought of the permanence, right? Like, when you think of disability, somebody who's been born with it, somebody who was, living their life as this, specific limitation. But really, disability happens at the point of interaction, right, between a person and society. It's not, something they're born with. It's they're not disabled until they have to maybe open up a can of something or open up milk, right? That's when the disability raises its, ugly face. But it's not the temporal aspect either. It could be situational, it could be permanent, it could be whatever, right? It's the interaction, the situation that they're in that really makes the disability prevalent.
I really actually like that height example, because I think of, like, if you ever walk into a house and the mirrors all seem to either be way too high or way too low, and clearly someone designed, this house for someone of a certain height. So that's really funny. That's what that made me think of. But I think something similar applies to product design too. Like, I used to get the larger iPhones And over time, I started to like feel pain in like my fingers and my hand in general. And it was because a lot of the touch targets that I was used to just weren't comfortable for me. So I ended up reverting back to the regular size iPhone. So yeah, it applies there too.
Yeah, the height one reminded me too of like anyone out there that's been a parent that has a stroller and you buy like this really fancy stroller that has the adjustable, heights and all this, and then you pick up an umbrella stroller so you can go somewhere traveling or something. And umbrella strollers are like, I think, made for like 5-year-old children. I mean, to push them, because they're really myself and my wife are both tall, and we have to arch our backs and pushing these things. We're like, we're not designed for people that were taller. Boo-hoo us, right? But it's just that was an example, and it reminded me of that. Is heights we do design things thinking of like measuring the height of our desk, and why is it that height, and there are code standards even to where a plug should be. But this also reminded me of an example of some usability studies that we were doing, and we had someone that came in and she was paraplegic, and she was using the app and using her phone, and she had sat it on her arm and was typing. And we asked her if there was a different way that she would prefer to, if we had speech to talk or something. She actually was not from our country either. She had a very heavy accent. And she said, no, actually, I would prefer to be able to take my time and chat with somebody over text rather than talk with them, because every time I talk with someone on the phone, they ask me to repeat myself, or they are rushing me through thought. And because English is not my first language, it takes me more time to think about what I'm trying to say. And those were examples that came to mind when we were talking about this.
Yeah, I think I have two. One is the height thing. In my apartment building, we have these lockers where the Amazon packages go. And I was going through the settings one day and I saw that you could toggle on like, it had the picture of the wheelchair, and it's like, do you want your packages to go to the bottom so you don't have to like reach up? And I just toggled that on because yeah, I can't see or reach or know if there's any more packages in the top one. So that's probably like a mismatch tension there. I think another one is just like closed captions. I know that they were, intentionally made for people who couldn't hear or hard of hearing. I use closed captions all the time for everything. I just can't watch TV without it. And that's just me. I don't know. It's like a habit now. Maybe another one is like the wheelchair for the sidewalks. They had to like level them down. And I think a lot of people benefit from that, from people like riding scooters or strollers as well. So I don't know, like when we make things accessible, we kind of make it better for everyone to use. So.
Yeah, for sure. That ramp example, I think I talked about it earlier in the week with some people, and we all benefited when they stopped putting ramps at the far side of the building and just made it so when you walked into the entrance of the building, it was sloped. Look at pools now. A lot of pools have used to have lifts that would lift people into the pool, and now there's zero entry pools everywhere. And that is great for everyone, right? Like it's just a more pleasant experience.
Yeah, I switched to my phone so I'd be able to actually participate instead of not being able to talk. All of this, like just listening to the discussion, like all of it makes me think about just understanding the context in which people are using your product or service or website or whatever it is you're designing for, whether they're disabled, not disabled, whether they are in a job where it's problematic to reach over and use the mouse, and maybe they need keyboard controls to make the repetitive process they're doing a lot faster to get through by making it tab throughable. Well, that also improves the experience for somebody using JAWS with a screen reader. So trying to think about those aspects. In thinking about context, another thing that's really interesting is we did a usability session with somebody that was not blind, but very visually impaired. And the session that we did with the user, she said she normally uses JAWS on her PC at work, but we were doing a session and she was using a Mac at home. And when she's using a Mac at home, she doesn't have access to JAWS, so she zooms in on everything to like 600%. Well, that was a really, a really bad experience, like watching her try to navigate the experience of submitting a time off request, which is the piece of the software we were working on at the time, working on improving. But improving the experience to where she could zoom in 600% and it works, improves the mobile experience. So, if you can zoom in on Chrome really far enough to where somebody with extreme visual disabilities can see the screen and get through a form, you're improving the experience for everyone. So understanding context, even for people with disabilities, they use things differently on different devices. And just talking to people about how they use your service, you can learn volumes about how you can improve it for everybody.
Bruno's article too, I think somewhere it links to Microsoft's inclusive design team and the work that they do. And there's this really great video. It's kind of like a compilation of the different research that they do. And one of the ones that stuck out to me was this woman who designed inclusive playgrounds. And just inclusive environments in general, but it was really cool listening to the thought process of her talking about, a child that's in a wheelchair wants to be included just as much as everyone else. So she had designed things to where everything that reached a certain height, whatever a child could climb or, make their way up to, there was an alternative sort of ramp system that also matched that same height so that they were able to see the exact same things that everyone else is saying. So that was really cool. I advise you check that out if you haven't already.
Yeah, I saw that video and I had a few tears dropping down from my face when I was watching it. And yeah, it made me so happy.
I loved it. Does anyone else have any examples? Any other examples? Oopsie. All right. So I've got this quote here that I thought was great. Disability is not just a health problem. It is a complex phenomenon reflecting the interaction between features of a person's body and features of the society in which he or she lives. Oops. And so we're going to jump into the second principle, which is learning from diversity. So how has learning from diversity helped you in your work?
I can kick this off. I think this is like a quasi joke, but I do think it has made me more apprehensive when I kind of realized that everyone is moving to a more digital world. And on top of that, there are now so many things that are only available in the digital world. I think not learning about diversity or not knowing enough, I think brings me some level of anxiety in terms of how am I doing the best I can for other people that I'm solving problems for. But I think one of the ways that honestly I've learned about diversity is through others, champions in the company who really care about that, who themselves might not be able to sort of have a huge influence, but they do in terms of the conversations they're having, the things they're trying to talk about, and the things they're sharing with others from what they've learned. So I think the most I've learned is from other people sharing their personal experiences and in general, some of the challenges that they've faced before. And also some of the things that they would like to achieve sort of in their own roles, I think helps me better understand why they're advocating for like diversity to be a big part of everything, and why I fundamentally believe that if you are not learning from it, I think you will increasingly feel like you're failing at what you're trying to do. Again, personal opinion, but as everyone moves to be in a more digital world, the problems they will face if we're not focusing on these are actually pretty detrimental to society as a whole.
I actually want to read a quote that I pulled from the article that overlaps exactly what you're talking about. It says, diversity is something that changes over time. As humans, we have an amazing power to adapt to different situations. However, it's important to understand why people need to adapt to our interactions and services instead of the other way around. So with things constantly changing in the tech world, in the world in general, yeah, there's a lot of anxiety there for sure. But that just means there's more to learn all the time.
One thing I'd like to add to this is, like in the beginning when I started my career, there were things that, like as a technologist, I would be interested, or other people like me would be interested in learning and keeping up with this. But as I move forward, as I learned more about how other people use products and stuff like that, I came to realize that uh, anything that we are building right now, it may consume 8 hours of our life per day. But for some of our customers, unless you're building Facebook or Instagram and stuff like that, if you're building a bank application or a food delivery service, it's only like a tiny slice of their whole life, right? So our users don't need to know, or may not know, or may not have as much context about a product as we do. So understanding how 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 our product fits into a user's life, in their whole day, and how they use it in that aspect has helped me realize that I need to have more empathy towards everyone else.
I think learning about the diversity, I think it's how it helped me is, how do I put this in words? I guess I don't need permission from anyone to start doing it. Like I am the gatekeeper of change, and I can just start adding designs and creating these designs to help or include people. For example, like imagery, I started adding images that are not your typical, like, you know, your stock image. Like I really go hard and find stock images of all different people and then try to include them in my work. So I actually just go the extra step and make sure that I'm keeping myself accountable and like making change happen. So yeah, I'm just trying to be active on it.
Anybody else? I'm going to start going into the last principle, which is to solve for one and extend to many. So what are some products or services that come to mind when you think of inclusive design? I know, Selena, you mentioned specifically the closed captioning. I use that for everything as well.
Yeah.
Especially Netflix. And I remember doing sort of like a comparison study like a while back, and I'm sure a lot of improvements have been made, but comparing Netflix versus Hulu, for example. And I remember at the time, because I took screenshots, like a lot of the main like parts of Hulu had this like super thin white text over all these like bright light colors, and you could barely read it. And that took me down like a rabbit hole of lawsuits and all sorts of other things that they had to go through. But clearly, you know, there was someone there who was paying attention to those things at Netflix. So
it's a hard question in a sense, because I think of more products and services that don't, than when I think about this when it comes to my mind. But I guess one I can think of is probably the big ones like Apple and Google. Apple in the sense of just how they're always thinking about improving their products for more people to use, and every year they try to make it better and better with their features. They don't really announce them, but like when they talk about 2,000 other features in iOS, like a lot of those features are accessibility features. But Google, there's a lot of tools that they have for web developers to become better. They have a lot of YouTube tutorials, a lot of courses, a lot of tools for us to check page speed, make sure that everyone is like trying to inclusive. They're trying to make Google Chrome Inspector better for accessibility and how to test accessibility. No one's perfect, but I think the attention of being better is there.
I think and Leah, the article in Microsoft might have covered this, I believe, but the adaptive controller that they came out with, I think that's one of the huge pioneering moments for gamers, right? Just like you were saying for playgrounds, right? There's kids just want to have fun. They just want to do, be a kid. And I think opening up that entire realm of gaming and not being able, I mean, I have a hard time sometimes with just my own controller, right? So I can't imagine folks who have some limitations, like cerebral palsy, wanting to just enjoy the same, getting shot in the head 800 times by 12-year-olds. So, the adaptive controller really opened up that ability for them to participate in that. So I thought it was amazing.
So a product to me that comes to mind is Nike's most recent no hands shoes. And my initial thought was like, oh, that'd be great for people who might be able, who might have some sort of like physical disability. And as soon as I had that thought, I was trying to like squeeze my foot into my shoes because I didn't feel like picking my shoes up to put them on. So I'm like, oh, nope, there it goes. It's for everyone. That sort of reminder again of like, yes, design is for everyone. And I'm very excited to see what those shoes look like. Knowing Nike, they're probably expensive. I haven't checked out the price, but I'm very curious to see like just people's general response for them.
Yeah, Selena, when you were talking about Apple, it reminded me of this video that I watched on YouTube of it was like a blind person showing people how they text on their phone. And that was something I had never seen before. Nothing I had ever seen in person before. That was pretty awesome. So I'm going to try to find that link and share that with everyone. And then what Thomas was saying too about the gaming industry, I started following a lot of PlayStation's designers on LinkedIn, and it's crazy the things that they're doing, even with just games and the options that they're, that they have in the settings now. And even just games that I play, like I can tell there's something there that's making this way easier than any games that I've, played previously. And then getting to hear them talk about those like incremental changes that they did. It's helping me and, everyone else who's got various disabilities.
One other product for me that comes to mind is this Nigerian product. I think it's from Nigeria, called M-Pesa. So it's not so much, I suppose, like disability, but I think it's the product. It's basically a financial app product. So you can send money through M-Pesa. But the problem that the people who made that in Nigeria had that was that not everyone has a smartphone. And most people have these old phones, and some people have smartphones, some people have these old phones. So how can you build a product or a platform that actually bridges this gap of this technological divide that seemed to be existing? So they came up with a pretty novel solution that you could send text messages to actually move money. And they made it secure enough that it would work out, such that they were able to essentially bring all of the entire population or anyone who adopted this platform onto the network by giving them a way to opt into it with the technology they have versus going and purchasing something else. Like a good counter example is Uber and Lyft, sort of in their early days, and a lot of them even today, where if you don't have a smartphone, you really cannot use their services. Like and you could say, well, who doesn't have a smartphone? But actually a large population of the world don't have smartphones. So there are kind of companies that are solving problems for them. I think another product that came out of India was that farmers could actually text a number and they would get prices for like the local market's crops, right? So they were able to get over this technological barrier and build something that everyone can use regardless of what technology they were using at. So really innovative work there. It's not necessarily restricted to disability or accessibility, but more like how do you get more people to leverage this thing we're building, and not just a few that are able to have financial means to do it through smartphones or something like that.
Yeah, Abhishek, one of the things that you reminded me of was, where you were talking about not everybody has the same type of, I think earlier I said something about devices, right? But also like, you think about, oh, surely people have wide bandwidth. People have the most up-to-date browser, just update your browser. There are companies that their IT groups will not allow you to update your browser, right? You are locked into IE9 or whatever the browser happens to be, however old it is, but they just aren't ready to upgrade and won't let you. And that limits a lot of people. I think things are getting better, but it's that inclusive thought and not exclusively around accessibility, but just making it available to everyone. So, yeah.
I want to piggyback off of that, Wes. I just ran into that at JPMC, JP Morgan. They're extremely locked down. Probably as locked down as one would usually see at a company since they're in finance. And you cannot update your browser. And people started running into accessibility issues with zooming in. And you aren't allowed to install there's like this specific tool that they allow you to install, but you have to put in a help desk ticket to get it into Chrome. So there's huge barriers to even getting that single extension for your accessibility stuff into Chrome through the company. But that's just, like you said, it's just that locked down, and that's how they do it. And it's really unfortunate, but I forgot all about that, honestly, until you brought that up.
Yeah, thanks.
Although really like this is maybe like a very different kind of problem. Thanks, Ryan. Thanks for joining. One of the things, so I think like everyone here, I have had to relearn about 6 different video conferencing tools over the last 8 months, because different people have, when they set up meetings, they set it up with their own conferencing tool. And now I have to learn how Teams work, and then how Zoom works, and then how Google Meet works, and what I can do with Google Meet that I can't do with Teams. But I do think Zoom is actually doing a really kick-ass job, because I keep seeing them add these little things that allow you to differentiate yourself. Like you can make faces and you can change your backgrounds, and Zoom was kind of early on in that. And one of the ways I think of that as inclusive design is, so you have everyone who is now forced to interact with people through a virtual screen. How much freedom and capability and sort of ability are you giving all of these individual people to express themselves? Right? And certain video tools are really going at it, where they're like, well, we will make you, like Teams will, like we will let you sit in like a classroom situation where you're sitting side by side instead of in front of each other. And Zoom has all these things, like you can add sound effects, and you can kind of put a cap, like a virtual cap on your head, and kind of do that. So they're really allowing people to differentiate and sort of express themselves, which again kind of comes back to inclusive design, because no one person is the same, and no one solution is like, especially these where it's a personality thing. You want to differentiate yourself, and the solutions that are thinking of those are things that I think are more aligned with that idea of, let's try to build the things that people want and different people want in different ways, versus just building this unique solution that just works and that's all it does.
Yeah, that's a good point too. I feel like usually the products and services that really go all in when it comes to inclusion, they're the ones that bring you like moments of joy while you're using it too. Does anyone else have any other examples? Thoughts?
I can't remember the name. I think it's OXO, where they have the can opener. I think that was made for someone that couldn't use a can opener, and they became a huge business, and they just made, I don't know if all their things are like accessible, like I don't know how to judge that, but I think it's just like bigger handles and just smoother process of like opening things. But I mean, like they made a business off of it. So I guess everyone really loves it and improves everyone's process of opening cans. Or whatever else I don't know what else products they have.
I have like all of their products and they're all good. The OXO Good Grips line, yeah, they had like, I think it started with a peeler, but yeah, I've even got their like dish scrubby thing. It's all good stuff.
I legit was opening a can this morning and thought, I wonder if they've changed the design of this. So there you go.
Cody, what is this in the chat?
So I didn't know that was the name of it. It's quite garish, the decapitator. I got this a long time ago at some small shop. I had no idea what it was. I just thought it was really cool looking. And I ended up using it for like the first time a couple months ago, and it blew my mind at how simple it was to open bottles. It's just you barely have to just push it down and it just pops right off. It's magnetic on the bottom, so the cap sticks to it so it doesn't go flying anywhere. It's the small things, you know.
I saw a decapitator and I was like, oh.
Yes, right. I didn't know that's what it was called. It's a little intense.
Must be really good. It's sold out.
It certainly is a memorable name. I will not forget it.
All right, so I think there's just one more slide, and I believe this is something that we, again, have already kind of touched on. So what design solution for a mismatch interaction has helped you? And Selena had brought up the closed captioning before. And the example that came to mind for me was, anytime I go on an airplane, if I forgot my headphones because they're Bluetooth and everything on an airplane needs an auxiliary. I've been on an airplane where I just sat and I just read through the whole movie. So that was a secret blessing in disguise. Did anyone else have any other examples?
Yeah, I've got one. Like, who knew we didn't need a key for our car? Like, it is so weird. I have an older car too that I have an older car that has a key, and when I get into it, I'm like, what? Oh yeah, the key's in my pocket, right? Like, it's just that button that you push seemed like such a silly idea years ago, and now it's like just an expected thing that helps you. You don't have to fumble with keys. It's kind of a safety thing. You can unlock your car more quickly. There's a lot of benefits to having that key fob rather than having to actually physically unlock your car.
One design that wasn't really helping me, was more helping my daughter. Back when she's forced back to school, but back when we were doing homeschooling, the facial recognition of signing in to the PC obviously helped her, trying to type in her email and password. We tried the PIN, but just having her step in front of the computer, recognize her face, and log in, that was a fantastic experience for her. And it really did, of course, trying to get her hair brushed, trying to get her teeth brushed, and just getting in front of a computer was hard enough. Now imagine adding the level of complexity of typing in a password just to log into the computer each time. So I think that was something that I really favored and appreciated during that time.
Yeah, does anyone remember before the pandemic when facial recognition was used for everything and then we all had to start wearing masks? I remember one of the first apps to ask me just for a passcode was the Target app. And I was like, oh my goodness, like I didn't realize I needed this. I'm glad that they figured it out sooner than later. So I can buy groceries without having to take off my mask. But that was something that I noticed a lot of people rolled out pretty quickly.
So piggybacking off of that with the facial recognition and the masks, one thing that I have noticed was like Samsung phones, which are Korean, they worked better. They worked better at recognizing eyes. Whereas, so like when you wore masks, because I think in Asia, like it's more common to wear masks, like when you're feeling ill. So Samsung phones had better capabilities at recognizing like the upper half of your face, whereas like iPhones had better recognition with like the lower side of your face. So if you were wearing sunglasses or something, they could still recognize that it was you. And I just thought that was like interesting once COVID hit. I was like, you know, I switched from from like the Galaxy to the iPhone, but the one thing would be helpful there. And then another design solution is like any voice features. So voice to text, voice interfaces, voice assistants, those are all really great design solutions because, you know, if you don't have access to your hands, then it's useful to just be able to speak into it.
This is a story I heard about Twitter. We all know Twitter recently changed their character limit, and we're all kind of curious why would you kind of do that as Twitter? The story I heard was about how Twitter has really like picked up. I mean, Twitter has kind of a lot of popularity in Japan, and some of the people at Twitter were very curious why that is. Japanese characters, so the story goes, the Japanese characters are actually more dense, so you can write little and convey a lot. So with the same 140 character limit, Japanese people could actually talk about a lot of different things. But anyone who was English speaking could not, right? So you were kind of limited to 140 characters. And if you really wanted to say the same thing in English, that was much harder for you because you would hit the character limit. So initially, I think they removed like attachments and images as part of the limit, and eventually just tried to like increase it. But I don't think they really wanted to ever increase the limit, but they found out that, well, we're not sort of being inclusive here in the sense that certain cultures can actually talk about a lot of different things where other cultures cannot. And so at least we want to kind of get that on par. Of course, now, like in Japanese culture, you could talk about a lot more, but at least other people now also have similar sort of capabilities. I don't know how, I did hear it from like one of the people who was a VP, so I'm assuming it was true. But that's a really neat sort of story around how it was not really mismatched. They were very intentional about keeping the character count low, but their design sort of was not equally successful across the board. And they had to make those changes to help everyone kind of express themselves in the sort of Twitter ideologue that they have.
Yeah, that's really interesting because like German has far more characters per word than even English, and so did that hinder adoption? You know, it's kind of neat.
I think a few, but when I used to work at the Apple store and people, you know, crack their screens, and sometimes the button would just not work anymore when iPhone had buttons. So we used to toggle the assistive touch, and that's how they were able to actually use their phone and not pay $200 to replace it. So that was a mismatch interaction. A lot of people didn't know about it. I think dark mode is another one. I think, you know, that was just for people like couldn't like take in light. And I think we all love dark mode now. It's kind of been kind of like the thing now. I love it. There's an option, put something in dark mode. Most likely I will. And oh, okay. This is when I was a kid. And I think we all kind of did it as we were kids, but you know, like the door that opens for people with wheelchairs, the button. Of course, that was not used for us, but it made me feel like I had magical powers, and I used it every single time. And I felt like I was like Jean Grey or something, and it made me feel like a queen walking through a door that opened for me. So yeah.
I love
So
that.
yeah, my wife cracked her phone, and for like a month she resisted going in and changing it. And so yeah, I enabled assisted touch for her because the button didn't, the physical button didn't work. So the assistive touch is definitely a mismatched use of that tool. One interesting one that I thought of, it's kind of a weird geeky one, is in Gmail, you can, with the checkboxes for your, you can click one and then scroll way down the list and then shift click and it'll click all the checkboxes in between. And I found myself on other user interfaces where I had a lot of checkboxes to deal with, to-do lists and other things. And I wanted to check a bunch of them. I found myself like shift and then trying to click, and like I couldn't do what I could do in Gmail, and it frustrated me. I ended up finding out that there was a Chrome plugin that allowed you to shift click across a set of checkboxes. And I don't use it very often, but now like anytime I encounter like a list of checks, I don't have to check every single box. But so it's an example of an enhancement that they decided to make. I don't know if they came up with the idea, if it's something that they had seen somewhere else, but it saves you a lot of time to not have to check a bunch of boxes.
Now we know that Jason just agrees to all the terms.
Check all the things.
I love the magic doorway though. Yes. For sure, we all felt that way.
Yeah, another Apple product too is the AirPods, again, with the pandemic and trying to stay hands-free. I never used voice to text until I realized I could do it through my AirPods, and I was going through the store, and that was a really great experience, being able to still communicate with people through text while I was trying to not touch, my face, my head. So that was a cool discovery.
Not to keep, hyping up Apple, but another one that I ended up loving was my Apple Watch unlocking my MacBook whenever I opened it. This was pre-Touch ID when I had just a regular password Mac. I thought that was just a blessing, especially when I had my whole desktop set up and my computer wasn't really near me, so I'd have to lean over and type it in. And then with that, they recently, thank goodness, with the Apple Watch, implemented that to the iPhone, of course, due to COVID. So now when it detects you have a mask on, if you have an Apple Watch with a passcode enabled and they're obviously connected, it'll still unlock automatically for you without having to enter your passcode. So it took a while for them to implement it, but I'm glad it's here now. And it's been really helpful, especially when out shopping.
Yeah, thinking about features that you get accustomed to and you're used to. I have a Roku device in one room and then I have a Roku TV in the other. And the Roku TV has a mute button, but the Roku device doesn't. And just something so basic as being able to mute a conversation and have it flip over to be closed caption. I don't use closed caption all the time, Selena, but I want it when I'm muted. And it's just such a different thing that I'm like, wow, this is just a no-brainer. Why doesn't everything have this? Yeah.
Anybody have anything else they'd like to share?
Since we kind of praised Apple a lot, I think one of the things that I also recently discovered, which is really diabolical once you know it, is Apple actually does not let third-party device makers like wearables use their in-app access, in-API access. So there would never be a watch that is as good as the Apple Watch. Because the Apple Watch can use backend APIs to connect to all the other things, right? So Pebble was one of the companies that actually had a really promising watch, but they eventually had to sell to, I think, Fitbit or something else, because Apple would just Apple didn't have a watch at the time, but Apple would actually never let them use any of the APIs to do all those things, right? Like to put on headphones and then automatically have music start playing in it. So that's kind of another flip side of a monopoly where the wearable sort of small company probably wanted to build everything Apple Watch does for us now, where we can't live without it. But Apple probably is the only company that really executed on it at the end of the day. And that's kind of what we all get, right? It's if you have two Apple devices, you're not going to try to go get a Fitbit watch because like it doesn't, even if Fitbit as a company can do all those things, they actually don't have permissions to do it, and Apple does. So ecosystem.
Well, we didn't touch on VR either. VR and AR and how it is connecting us in different ways too, where it may be mismatched, where you're not intending to do things. I went to a speed networking VR event a couple of weeks ago, and where you hopped from a chessboard to meet different people, and we were little avatars talking to each other, and it was really an interesting way to connect with people. And I'm not certain that was like the intention of how VR was initially thought of, but there are so many different applications that are happening, and it's much more accessible now because of the price point dropping because of Facebook. But Facebook has a lot of restrictions that are limiting our abilities to be able to maybe introduce things, because Oculus has an open platform, it's Android, but they're still restricting access to publishing your software. So it's kind of an interesting quandary that the industry is in right now. But it is making things, it's giving you access to a wide world, but also making you feel like you're right next to somebody when they're a long ways away, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, I think that I feel like a big part of why inclusive design is becoming like more and more in the spotlight is exactly because of that. It's things that have changed globally for everyone. We're all kind of discovering those same problems, not being able to use products the same way, not being able to talk to people the way that we're used to, or seeing people. So it's all really interesting, kind of seeing how all of this is bubbling up in a time like this.
Although I have to say, the push to open doors, like accessibility feature for like everybody, is great in this era. Because I don't want to touch any handles. It works out awesomely.
And all bathroom doors should push out. I don't want to touch the door handle.
Yeah, there's a lot of improvements that still need to be made to the public restroom in general, right?
Need a magic button. I don't want to touch that either, so I don't know. Wave at it.
I think the button has to be on your phone. So you just walk in front of a door, open your phone and hit a button, the door will open for you. That is the dystopia I'm looking forward to.
The IHOP by the airport actually has an automatic door opener for the bathroom, which is pretty amazing.
The IHOP? Okay. I was not expecting an IHOP.
I like the places that have like the foot hook at the restrooms, or like the foot pumps for sinks. So instead of having to like touch handles, you can just tap with your foot, which are actually more sustainable too, because you use less water that way. But you don't see them in many places.
Yeah, for sure.
I think that was the attempt for a lot of sinks that has the sensor that you're just supposed to put your hands in, but I just find myself just waving and doing a whole dance to try to get the water out. So clearly there needs to be a little more adjustment to that.
Well, they found that the hand sensors are less responsive to different skin tones. So I think when they were designing them and testing them, they only use people with like lighter skin tones. So then that's a different conversation regarding like inclusivity too, like within research, that I thought was interesting.
Thanks for that. I hadn't heard that. That's really interesting. We are at the end of our time, so I've got this last slide here that just has another quote from the article, which is really great. Inclusive design doesn't mean you're designing one thing for all people. You're designing a diversity of ways to participate. so that everyone has a sense of belonging. And I love all the examples that everybody just gave, because I think that all those little things definitely gave you a sense of belonging in that moment. So thanks for joining in on the discussion. So I got.
Yay.
Yay.
Thank you, Leah.
Yeah.
Yeah.